I never expected to cry in a bathroom stall on my own anniversary. And yet, there I was, sitting on the closed lid of a toilet in a five-star restaurant, mascara smudged under my eyes, trying to breathe through the quiet humiliation only someone you love can inflict. The night had started with such promise: white tablecloths, flickering candles, a table by the window with a view of the city lights reflecting off the harbor. I had worn the navy silk dress he once said made me look expensive, paired with the heels I only brought out for special occasions. I'd even curled my hair the way he liked, and for a while, I let myself believe this dinner would be different, that maybe, just maybe, 6 years into our relationship, Daniel would finally see me, really see me, not just as his quirky girlfriend with her little job, but as someone with substance, ambition, and value beyond how she looked on his arm. But then came the comment. Offhand, disguised as humor. We were sipping wine, scanning the menu, and I mentioned how one of the venues I consult for just closed a record quarter in revenue. That's when he laughed. Not the kind of laugh you share with someone, but the kind you laugh at someone with. "Your silly little food blog again?" he said, just loud enough for the couple at the next table to hear. "You know I love that you have a hobby, Claire, but let's not pretend it's a real business." Oh, my face went hot instantly, the wine I'd been enjoying turning to vinegar in my mouth. He didn't even notice. He kept talking, moving on to something about his firm's latest acquisition, as if he hadn't just sliced through my self-worth with a butter knife wrapped in charm. I excused myself, smiling too much, the kind of brittle smile women are conditioned to give when we're breaking inside but don't want to ruin the evening. In the bathroom, I locked myself in and stared at the cracks in the tile grout. I thought about the first time I told him what I did, how he smiled indulgently, like you would at a child who says they want to be an astronaut. I remembered all the times I'd shown him analytics, sponsor deals, follower growth, how he'd nodded absently and then asked when I'd consider getting a real job. I thought about the way his friends laughed when he introduced me as a culinary storyteller, then quickly added, "She writes about restaurants, mostly online." I had spent years diminishing myself to fit into a narrative that flattered his ego and spared him the discomfort of my success. I pulled out my phone and checked the numbers again, not because I needed validation, I knew them by heart, but because it anchored me in truth. 17 branded partnerships this year. A six-figure income from ad revenue and product collaborations. A weekly audience of nearly 400,000 readers across platforms. Restaurants I'd reviewed had gone on to earn Michelin stars. Chefs knew my name and feared my verdict. I had built something real, something that mattered. And yet, the man I'd shared a bed with for half a decade still saw it as a hobby. Not because he didn't understand the business, but because admitting its legitimacy meant reckoning with the fact that I didn't need him. When I returned to the table, something had shifted in me, not visibly. Outwardly, I was the same, composed, smiling, polite, but underneath there was steel forming where softness used to be. I asked the waiter for the check before dessert, ignoring Daniel's surprise. "Already?" he asked, laughing nervously. "We haven't even toasted yet." I raised my glass then, held it in midair and said, "To clarity." He clinked without understanding. The irony was almost poetic. I knew something he didn't. Something that would shatter the neat little power dynamic he'd clung to all these years. I just hadn't decided whether tonight was the night I'd let him know. What he didn't know, what no one at that restaurant knew, was that 3 weeks earlier, the owners of the very place we were sitting in had reached out to me privately. They were retiring. The lease on the property was about to expire, and they were looking for a buyer who understood not just the brand, but the soul of the place. They had read my piece on them 2 years ago, the one that went viral, and credited it for the wave of new clientele that had revived their business. "We'd rather pass the keys to someone who gets it," the email read, than a faceless chain. I had spent the last 21 days doing due diligence, negotiating terms, lining up financing with my business advisor. The deal was nearly finalized. I hadn't told anyone, not even my assistant, but the papers were in my bag, and if I chose to, I could end the evening not just as Daniel's girlfriend, but as the new owner of his favorite restaurant. It wasn't always like this. There was a time when I would have done anything for Daniel's approval, when a compliment from him could float me through an entire week. I met him when I was still waitressing at a downtown bistro, fresh out of a failed startup and drowning in the shame of having moved back in with my mother at 26. He wore tailored suits like armor, spoke in crisp financial idioms, and made me feel like I'd stumbled into a movie where I didn't belong. When he asked for my number, I remember thinking, he must be mistaking me for someone else. That night, I Googled the name on his Platinum Amex receipt, Daniel Archer. Mid-level partner at a private equity firm, 6-figure bonus track, the kind of man my mother would call a good match. I convinced myself I was lucky, grateful even. Back then, I was only just beginning to rebuild. My first company had failed in public, spectacular fashion, a niche app for at-home food reviews that never made it past beta. Investors pulled out. My name was mocked on foodie forums. I went from conference panels to collecting unemployment in less than 6 months. The humiliation was bone deep, and in that vulnerable state, Daniel looked like stability. He took me to wine bars I couldn't pronounce, ordered for me in French, and told me to stop worrying about branding and just get a job with a 401k. I laughed when he said it, even though I didn't think it was funny. I told myself he was practical, that he cared, that he just wanted me to be secure. What I didn't understand then was that he needed me to be small so that he could remain the impressive one. But I didn't stay small. Something in me, something stubborn and wired with fire, refused to stay down. I started writing again, quietly, anonymously at first. Short reviews of local spots on an old WordPress blog with no real audience. I wrote like my life depended on it, because in a way it did. The words helped me make sense of the world, helped me remember who I was before failure defined me. People started reading, then commenting, then sharing. Within a year, I was being invited to media previews, tasting menus, soft launches. I monetized slowly, carefully, making sure I never lost the trust of my growing community. I signed my first brand partnership with a cookware company the same week Daniel made his first managing partner pitch. He never asked about my win. I never forced him to. There's a moment in every woman's life, I think, when she stops trying to be digestible. Mine came the night I hit 250,000 followers. I looked in the mirror, saw someone who'd clawed her way out of shame and obscurity, and realized she was still dating a man who rolled his eyes every time she opened her laptop. That was the first time I thought seriously about leaving. But then he planned a trip to Napa for my birthday, and I folded. We had wine under the stars, and he told me I had potential, as if that word was a gift he could bestow. I stayed. I stayed because walking away felt like admitting I'd failed again. I stayed because he knew how to make me feel like he was all I deserved. I stayed because love, when laced with condescension, can still feel a lot like safety if you've been starved of true support for long enough. The restaurant we were sitting in, Le Vespertine, wasn't just Daniel's favorite. It had been the first place I ever reviewed under my real name. I had saved up for a tasting menu, dined alone, and written a 3,000-word piece that exploded across the internet. Chefs reposted it. Diners booked months in advance after reading it. The owners sent me flowers. That review changed everything. It told the industry I was serious, and more importantly, it told me I was serious. Sitting there that anniversary night, being belittled by the very man who had watched my rise with quiet discomfort, I felt the symbolic weight of it all. He laughed in the exact place where I had once found my voice. The irony was exquisite, and I knew then I couldn't let this place fall into the wrong hands. Not his, not anyone's. So when he excused himself to take a call, some client in Singapore, something about time zones, I reached into my bag and pulled out the manila folder. Inside, the final draft of the purchase agreement, a few signatures away from making me the majority owner. I ran my fingers over the paper, thinking not just of what it represented in terms of business, but in personal reclamation. This wasn't just about owning a restaurant. It was about rewriting the narrative he'd tried to lock me into. The narrative where I was amusing, decorative, and ultimately lesser. If I signed that paper, I wouldn't just be buying Le Vespertine. I'd be buying back the part of myself I'd spent 6 years handing over, piece by piece, in exchange for proximity to someone who never really saw me. He came back to the table with his usual confident gait, phone tucked into his inner jacket pocket, already recounting some triumphant anecdote about closing a deal with a notoriously difficult client. I nodded politely, but my mind was elsewhere, already rehearsing the steps I was about to take. I reached for my purse again, this time under the guise of checking the time, and confirmed the folder was still there. There was a part of me that wanted to drag this out, to savor the moment, but another part, the part that had quietly tolerated being reduced for too long, knew that this power shift wasn't about theatrics. It was about clarity. I folded the folder in half and slid it back in, determined to wait until the end of the meal. Not for dramatic effect, but because I wanted to finish this dinner on my terms. I wouldn't let him derail it again. We talked, or rather, he talked, and I nodded. He went on about market trends, leveraged buyouts, and how Gen Z investors don't understand risk. I smiled when appropriate, even laughed once, reflexes honed by years of emotional labor. But inside, I was auditing every interaction, every comment, every time he'd looked at me with that blend of amusement and dismissal. I remembered our third anniversary, when I gave him a framed photo of us in Santorini, and he gave me a vacuum cleaner because he thought my apartment needed an upgrade. I remembered the dinner where I tried to explain my vision for expanding into video, and he responded by saying, "Babe, maybe stick to what you're good at, writing about soup." The recollections weren't just memories now, they were evidence. Evidence of the slow erosion of my confidence under the weight of his subtle condescension. The check arrived. He reached for it automatically, out of habit and ego, and I let him. It would be the last time. As he signed the bill, I placed my hands on the table, folded, and said evenly, "I need to tell you something." His pen hovered midair. "This place, the one we're sitting in, it's mine now." For a second, he didn't react, just blinked, as if I'd spoken in another language. "What do you mean it's yours?" he asked, laughter already curling into the corners of his mouth. "Like, you booked the reservation?" I met his eyes, letting the full weight of the truth settle between us. "No, Daniel. I mean, I bought it. The owners reached out to me last month. I finalized the paperwork tonight. I'm the new owner of Le Vespertine." The silence that followed was a different kind, dense, brittle, the kind that precedes something breaking. He laughed, loudly, incredulously, the kind of laugh that tries to reclaim control through dismissal. "You're joking," he said, eyes scanning my face for any trace of irony. "Claire, come on. You bought a restaurant? This restaurant? With what? Your blog money?" His voice dripped with condescension so thick it made my stomach turn. "Yes," I said calmly. "With my blog money. With the audience you've never believed in. With the sponsors you roll your eyes at. With the brand I built while you told me to grow up." He opened his mouth to respond, but for once, I didn't let him. "You said this place was perfect. You brought clients here, friends, dates before me. You loved it because it made you feel important. Well, now it's mine, and I'm deciding what kind of men get to sit at my tables." The look on his face was something I will never forget. Not anger, exactly. Not at first. It was confusion, disbelief, like someone realizing too late that the rules of the game had changed, and no one had told him. He leaned back, arms crossed, mask slipping as he searched for a way to reassert dominance. "So what? You're trying to prove something?" he asked, voice clipped. "Trying to embarrass me?" I shook my head slowly. "No, Daniel. This isn't about you. It's about me reclaiming something you've spent years trying to take from me. My voice, my value, my sense of self. I'm not performing anymore. Not for you, not for anyone." I stood up then, not in a huff or storm, but with purpose. I picked up my purse, slid the folder out one final time, and placed it gently on the table. "That's the ownership agreement," I said, "in case you still think this is a joke." As I walked out, heels clicking against the marble floor, I felt a stillness settle in my chest. Not triumph, not vengeance, just relief, like I'd been holding my breath for 6 years and finally exhaled. The maitre d' nodded respectfully as I passed. A server I recognized from my last tasting gave me a quiet smile. Outside, the city pulsed with light and movement, oblivious to the small revolution that had just occurred inside that dining room. I didn't look back, not because I didn't care, but because I finally did. I cared enough about myself to walk away without needing to witness his reaction. Power, I realized, wasn't in the owning, it was in the choosing. And that night, I had chosen myself. The next morning felt unreal, like waking up in someone else's apartment, except it was my own, and everything had shifted overnight. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan, its steady rotation the only predictable thing in a world that now felt wide open and wild. The man I had once imagined marrying hadn't called, hadn't texted, and part of me was grateful. I wasn't ready to process him. I was still processing me. I brewed coffee the way I liked it. Extra strong, no sugar, almond milk steamed just right, and sat at the tiny kitchen table where I used to draft blog posts after midnight while Daniel slept, unaware or uninterested. Now, that same table felt like a command center. My inbox was flooded. Messages from chefs, reporters, 2 local investors who had heard rumors and wanted to discuss expansion possibilities. I ignored them all for the moment. I needed to sit in the stillness, to remember who I was, without the noise. But the silence didn't last long. By noon, news had broken. One of the junior staffers at Le Vespertine had posted a congratulatory message tagging me, and within hours, Eater had picked it up. Claire Donovan, food media maven, acquires famed Le Vespertine. I read the headline 3 times before I allowed myself to believe it. Comments poured in. Most were celebratory, some skeptical. A few trolls, of course. Influencers don't belong in fine dining. But I'd weathered worse. What struck me most were the private DMs. Other women, writers, chefs, sommeliers, sending messages like, "You give me hope," or "I've worked in kitchens for 15 years and never thought someone like me could own something like that." Their words made something behind my ribcage ache, because that had been me, not so long ago, convinced the gatekeepers would never hand me a key. And now here I was, holding not just a key, but the whole damn lock. I went to the restaurant that afternoon, not as a guest, but as its owner. The staff was gathered for their usual pre-service meeting when I walked in. The room went quiet, all eyes on me, and for a moment I felt like an imposter in my own story. Then the head chef, a wiry man named Javier with knife-calloused hands and skeptical eyes, nodded at me once. "Owner's here," he said. "Let's hear what she's got." I took a breath. "I won't pretend to know your jobs better than you," I said. "I didn't buy this place to tear it apart. I bought it because I believe in it, and in you. I'll need time to learn the back end. I'll make mistakes, but I promise I'll never treat any of you like you're replaceable." A pause. Then one of the servers, young, bright-eyed, probably early 20s, whispered, "Hell yeah." And just like that, the room softened. That night, I stayed late after close, walked the space table by table, touching the wood like it might speak back. In the kitchen, I ran my hands over the polished counters, the hanging pots, the spice drawers meticulously labeled. This place held so many stories. First dates, last anniversaries, proposals, breakups, deals brokered over wine. I thought about all the times I'd sat in this dining room, either with Daniel or alone, and how each meal had fed not just my body, but my vision. I didn't want to turn this place into a shrine, nor did I want to leave it frozen in time. It deserved to evolve, to grow, just like I had. As I stood behind the bar, sipping the last glass of wine poured that night, I pulled out my phone and opened a blank note. At the top, I typed, "New menu vision, nourishment as narrative." Then I smiled. It sounded like me. But of course, Daniel didn't stay silent forever. He texted 2 days later. No apology, no congratulations. Just, "You really bought it. I underestimated you." I stared at the screen, thumb hovering. The old me might have replied, might have tried to explain, soften the blow, invite conversation, but I'd spent enough of my life translating myself for men who refused to learn my language. So instead, I closed the message and archived the thread. I didn't need his validation. I had mine. And for the first time, that was enough. That night, I updated my site's bio. Gone was the careful modesty, the qualifiers. In its place, Claire Donovan, founder, writer, restaurant owner, culinary strategist, storyteller. No more pretending, no more minimizing. I was done being small. The following week, I held a soft relaunch dinner for select press and longtime supporters. I wore the navy dress again, not for nostalgia, but for reclamation. My assistant cried when I gave a toast about visibility, resilience, and women building without permission. The head chef surprised me with a dessert inspired by my very first review, peach and rosemary tart with a lavender glaze. "Thought you'd want a taste of where it all started," he said. And he was right. As I took a bite, I felt it. The full circle moment, the bittersweet joy of knowing the woman I had become was everything the younger version of me had dreamed of. Not because she had power or ownership or press attention, but because she finally stopped waiting to be seen and decided instead to see herself. It's funny how silence can feel different depending on who you are. The silence I once endured in Daniel's penthouse, polished, glassy, and full of unsaid judgments, used to make me feel small, like I had to earn my right to speak. Now the silence of my restaurant before opening, just after the floors are mopped and the lights are dimmed to a warm amber, feels sacred. It's the kind of quiet that hums with potential, with peace. Some mornings I arrive early just to sit in the dining room alone with a coffee and let the past wash through me. I think about that night, the dinner, the laugh, the purchase, and how none of it was really about him. It was about the part of me that had been whispering for years, "You are more than what they see," and finally got to shout. Owning something changes you, not just legally or financially, but spiritually. There's a different weight to your steps when the building responds to your decisions. The first time I signed a paycheck with my name at the bottom, I cried. Not because of the money, though that mattered too, but because I realized that for the first time, I was the one setting the table for others. I wasn't just asking for a seat. I was building the damn dining room. And people came. Former readers, chefs, food writers who'd once dismissed me, even skeptics. Some just to see if I'd fail. Most stayed. The first month was rocky. We had kitchen equipment fail, a wine shipment that arrived 3 days late, a review that called our opening menu too safe. But none of that shook me. I had been through worse. And now, I wasn't doing this to impress anyone. I was doing it because I believed in it. There were nights when I left after midnight, shoes in hand, hair undone, thinking, this is the hardest thing I've ever done. But those thoughts were always followed by another, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. Because the thing about finally choosing yourself is that everything you build afterward carries the imprint of that decision. The menu evolved, the team bonded, and the dining room began to feel like a living story. Each guest, a new chapter. I started a mentorship program for young food writers from underrepresented backgrounds. I hosted community nights with sliding scale pricing. I named a private dining space after my grandmother, who taught me how to cook before I could spell restaurant. I was building something more than a business. I was building a legacy rooted in inclusion, in nourishment, in truth. Daniel resurfaced one more time. He came to the restaurant unannounced 3 months after the acquisition, dressed impeccably, with a new woman on his arm. I saw them from the kitchen window, standing at the host stand. My maitre d', who knew the story, looked at me for instruction. I took a deep breath and said, seat them, corner table, treat them like anyone else. The meal went smoothly. He didn't ask to speak to me. She smiled a lot, laughed at his stories. When they left, he didn't look back. Neither did I. It wasn't satisfying in the way I once imagined it would be, but it was clean. No final confrontation, no dramatic closure, just distance. And that, I realized, was its own kind of power. Now, when people ask how I got here, I tell them the truth. I don't skip the messy parts. I talk about the blog, the failures, the laughter at my expense, the night I bought the restaurant out of equal parts clarity and quiet rage. But I always end with this. No one believed in me the way I needed them to. So I did it myself, and that made all the difference. Because belief from others is nice, but belief in yourself is non-negotiable. Everything else can be built from there. Walls, menus, entire lives. So if you're reading this, if you've ever been laughed at, belittled, told your dreams are small or silly, I hope you know that they're not. They are yours, and that alone makes them sacred. Build them anyway. Build them slowly. Build them even when no one claps. And one day when they walk into the space you created with your own hands and heart, let them look around and see what you've done. You don't owe them a seat at your table. But if you offer one, make sure it's because you want to, not because you need to prove anything. That's what I learned. That's what I live by now. And every time I walk through the doors of my restaurant, I remember the only approval I ever needed was my own.